Welcome to this week's episode of the Real Lawyers Podcast, brought to you by LexBlog, the world's largest legal publishing network. I'm honored, and I say that very seriously, to be joined by someone I consider both a hero and a role model, and that's David Lat. He's not only one of the nicest people you'd ever want to have the occasion to meet, but a true pioneer in legal publishing. David's journey has gone from anonymous blogger to a nationally recognized legal commentator on all fronts. He's a Harvard and Yale educated lawyer turned writer. He rose to prominence in the mid-2000s by personality and even a bit of gossip he brought to the legal profession, which was absent a lot of that then. From his early days that some of you may know about, anonymously chronicling the judiciary, to founding Above the Law, to now publishing his widely followed Original Jurisdiction, a newsletter on Substack, David has shown how lawyers can really get out there and be a citizen journalist with creating their own environment. His story is a testament to how legal blogging can really inform, connect, and ultimately shape the legal profession. So, David, it's great to have you here today, and I mean that in every sense of the word.
It is great to be here, Kevin. I have long admired your work as well, and it's wonderful to join you.
I'd like to, ask you some questions about the origins and identity of how maybe this all came about. But you took a very traditional path. I mean, you're Harvard, you go on to Yale, Wachtell, the U.S. Attorney's Office. Now, that looks, pretty straight line for a lot of people that happen to be very smart. But where did the publishing bent come from? Where did that all start to come about?
So it's interesting. Even before I went to law school, I was interested in writing and publishing. In high school, I was the editor of our opinion journal. And then in college, I worked on the school newspaper, the Harvard Crimson. And then when I went to law school, that sort of fell by the wayside, except for law journal stuff, but that's really a different kind of publishing. But when I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey, working as a federal prosecutor, I found that I kind of missed that writing, that more free kind of writing that didn't involve Blue Book citations. And so I started a blog. This was in the early days, back in 2004. And I didn't really know what I wanted to write about, but I thought, well, I was fascinated and remain fascinated by the federal judiciary. So I thought, let me write about judges. And I started a blog called Underneath Their Robes, news, gossip, and colorful commentary about the federal judiciary. And that's pretty much what it was. I didn't focus on the substance of their decisions or on doctrine. There were already a few blogs that did, like Howard Bashman's How Appealing or Eugene Volok's Volok Conspiracy. I was really more focused on the judges as people. And so, as you mentioned, there was, in addition to news and analysis, a little bit of gossip and a little bit of humor in the pages of Underneath Their Robes.
Yeah, some of us would start to look at it and we go, okay, there's an irreverence going on here that really, because you had, you had labels that you characterize men, and then you had labels that you characterize women. I mean, some people that have been around as lawyers don't recall that all of a sudden popping up on the screen. So what were the characteristics you used to describe a certain judge of the week or different judge of the week? I can remember some of them vaguely, but what was it all?
One thing I did, which I would not do today, obviously, was I had a Super Hotties of the Federal Judiciary contest, a contest to find not just, to find the most attractive men and women on the federal bench. That definitely got the blog noticed. Again, I wouldn't do it today, but It definitely put me on the map. I did blind items about judges, just like page 6 of the New York Post, where I would say, this judge got divorced and made her clerks pack up her house or something like that. And I wouldn't reveal who the judge was, but I did things of that nature. So it was irreverent, as you were saying. It was humorous. I talked about judges who were sometimes challenging to appear before or, hard on their clerks. But I also talked about judges who were doing great things and who were writing wonderful opinions and who were very great to work for. So it really ran the gamut. And I would say that even though it was irreverent or occasionally, I guess you could use the word snarky, there was also a real tone of appreciation and admiration for federal judges.
Right. Now that was anonymous. I mean, nobody knew who David Lat was at that time. Um, who was running the U.S. Attorney's Office that you were working at that point in time?
Yes, so this was under Chris Christie, who then later went on to become governor of New Jersey and then later a presidential candidate. And as you mentioned, it was under a pseudonym. I realized that if being a federal prosecutor, I could probably get in a little bit of trouble writing irreverently about judges by night and appearing before them by day. So I adopted this anonymous persona called Article 3 groupie, Article 3 being the provision of the Constitution that sets up the Supreme Court, and groupie being a fangirl. And I do mean fangirl because I also pretended to be a woman while I was doing all of this.
And ultimately it came out. How did the story break that all of a sudden it's David Lat? How did that all come about?
So I had been doing it under a pseudonym for about a year and a half, and I was enjoying it, and it was getting readership and traction in a very limited niche, mainly confined to clerks and judges, but it was getting traction. And I think some of your listeners and folks involved in LexBlog can relate to this. I wasn't fully able to realize the benefits of my publishing or my blogging because I was under this pseudonym. It certainly wasn't making me any money, but it wasn't also advancing my profile or moving me forward professionally or anything like that. So I decided to give an interview to Jeffrey Toobin, who was at the time the legal correspondent of The New Yorker, where I revealed myself as the author of this blog. And so this is a bit of an abbreviated version, but that's essentially how it all went down. And that was in November of 2005 that I revealed myself as the author of this blog.
And I remember, I might have been recently reading about, it was controversial for some people in the office and thought, well, David's going to have to go. But that Chris Christie may have recognized, hey, it's okay. We want people to be inspired to do things. I mean, how was that all handled? What were your observations, I guess?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Chris is definitely a larger than life figure. If people have seen clips of him on YouTube and whatnot, he can definitely have a temper, and he definitely has a way with words if he's not happy with you. But Chris was actually really gracious when he found out about my little extracurricular pursuit. I had shut down the blog by that point on the advice of one of my mentors in the office when I came to him and said, uh-oh, I'm in trouble because there was a lot of negative press initially about this. How do I keep my job? And so my mentor, Charlie, said, well, first of all, shut down the blog. Second, schedule an appointment to see Chris. And third, when you do meet with Chris, beg. So I made this appointment to see Chris, and I really sort of threw myself on his mercy. But I did tell him, look, I realize I put the office in this very awkward position, and if you want me to go, I will resign quietly. But he was very gracious about it, and he said, look, you've put the blog behind this password. That's what I had done. I didn't want to delete the archives of a year and a half's worth of work, but I put the blog behind a password. And he said, look, the blog's behind a password, and you were doing good work as a federal prosecutor, as an assistant U.S. attorney. So let's go back to the way things were. So we did for a time, but again, and I'm sure a lot of your readers and clients can relate to this, I found I missed the blogging too much. It wasn't the same when I was just back to working on my cases, but I couldn't engage in this writing. I just loved doing it. And so a couple of weeks later, I left the U.S. Attorney's Office and I took a full-time blogging job at Wonkette, which is a politics blog that's still around. At the time, it was owned by Gawker Media, and the original founding editor, Anna Marie Cox, was leaving to go work for Time Magazine, which is what you did back then if your blog hit it big. You would go work for a mainstream media outlet. This was in 2005, 2006. Now people just kind of keep on going indefinitely with their blogs. But that was the success back then. You would go work for a larger media organization. So she was leaving to go work for Time. They needed to go and find new editors. And so they hired me and this one other fellow, Alex Perrine, who still writes about politics. And I moved down to Washington, D.C. and became a full-time blogger.
It is interesting today when you thought that you needed to accomplish something. People were asking me, well, why would lawyers blog? Aren't they going to have to keep it behind a paywall? Or are they going to charge for it? And I said, well, the unique thing that lawyers have is they do have a business model, and that is that they charge for their time. And if they build up notoriety through blogging, it works out. Believe it or not, there's still people that think somehow they shouldn't give away their writing online, even on it. Your upbringing is unique. I mean, you're back now living with a family in New Jersey. It also happens to be where you grew up. How did your family influence you, your family history? I got to follow that through some of Facebook and other places. But, your parents are both immigrants, Filipino doctors. You went to good schools in New Jersey, I believe Catholic schools. How did that all influence David Lat, who you became, what you did?
Yes, it's an interesting story. I, as you mentioned, grew up in New Jersey. I went to high school at Regis High School, which is an all-boys Catholic school in Manhattan. And then I went to Harvard and Yale Law School. And I practiced law for about 6 or 7 years before I decided to move full-time into blogging and writing. And I think initially my parents didn't know what to make of it. They, as you mentioned, are doctors. They came from the Philippines. They weren't really familiar with this world of writing and journalism. And law, at least they could understand, was a stable, prestigious, lucrative profession. Becoming a professional blogger just, I think, was a little confusing to them. And so I think it was a little, it took a little explaining to sort of just kind of tell them about my new path. It was funny. I remember we went out to a Thai restaurant in Manhattan where I was going to tell them that I was leaving the practice of law and I was going to move down to DC to take this job at Wonkette. And it was at the time a very high profile blog. And so I thought they would be excited, but they seemed a little confused. And I said to them, well, you don't seem that excited about this. I want you to be proud of me. And my dad said, don't worry, David. We were proud of you. And I think what he meant by that was, you've accomplished so much at this early age. We'll always be proud of you. We'll always be in your corner. But I interpreted it as you were proud of me, like past tense. But look, I just kind of had to chart my own path and it all worked out. And now my parents are very proud of me and totally understand and appreciate what I do. I think and remember, this was back in 2006. So Yep. This was the early days of blogging. You've had a couple of other guests from those early days, like Carolyn Elephant recently. But blogging was not as widespread or mainstream or as accepted as it later came to be. So it was, I think, a gutsy thing for me to leave behind a successful legal career to pursue blogging.
Yeah, I think there were a limited few that could see some potential that, publishing and writing is been around for hundreds of years in the United States. And for lawyers, it should be. But yeah, I mean, in 2005, I'm writing about blogging. I think it was Ernie Svensson from Louisiana that just started really early. And he goes, what are you going to write about next week? On all this. There was one funny story that I remember reading about. Didn't Nixon live in and around your neighborhood in New Jersey? And
Yes,
you gone over to shake his hand, be polite to him, whatnot.
Yes, he was one of our local celebrities. I grew up in a town called Saddle River, and I lived there from second grade onward. My parents still live there in the house I grew up in. And Richard Nixon, after his presidency, lived in Saddle River. And so everyone would go over there. He had candy, but he would also have some other additional supplemental gift. One time it was these pens with his name engraved on the barrel, although I think my pen didn't work. Another time, they had these orange cards, the Nixon family wishes you a happy Halloween, and they were autographed. That's probably in my parents' basement or attic somewhere. Maybe I can sell it on eBay. But it was a fun thing to actually go to trick-or-treating with Tricky Dick, as I put it.
You came to do Above the Law. And my first experience with Above the Law was, back then we had things called blog rolls, that we would put lists of blogs on the side. And there was a writer named Rebecca Blood, and I had picked up 2 books on blogging. This was back in 2003 or 2004. That made my heart race because I go, oh my God, this is going to be so good for lawyers. And one of which was when you put a list of blog on the side, and then you click it, and people would see where people were coming from. And I go, who are these Above the Law people? And then my take was, people go, well, this is the silliest thing ever. I said, well, wait a second. The demographic for law, in some cases, is very affluent people. Even young lawyers are making a lot of money if they start to read this publication. What was it that said, okay, I'm going to leave Wonkette, I'm going to start Above the Law. I'm driven to start my own deal?
Yeah, so what essentially happened was when I moved to Wonkhet, I discovered that I liked blogging. But again, I found that I missed writing about the law. And even though politics is certainly closely related to law, it is distinct. And I found I had much more knowledge and many more contacts in the legal world. So that's when I came up with the idea for Above the Law. It was essentially going to be like a Wonkhet, but for the legal world. Or it was going to be like Underneath Their Robes, but not just about the judiciary. It would cover law firms and law schools and the broader legal world. And so I came up with this idea and I pitched it to a group of investors who had a company that already had one successful blog, a finance blog called Dealbreaker. The company is now known as Breaking Media. I pitched it to them and they liked the idea. And so I went into business with them and we launched Above the Law in August of 2006. So next year it'll be 20 years old, which is kind of hard to believe. But what you were saying about the demographics definitely rang true for us. We thought, look, the audience is a very well-heeled, educated audience. This is an audience that advertisers and sponsors should want to reach. And so all these years later, Above the Law is a commercially very successful property. It has a lot of advertisers or sponsors. I'm no longer editorially involved, although I am still a part owner of Breaking Media, the parent company. So I definitely want Above the Law to continue to do well as an investor, essentially. But that was really the impetus. We saw this niche in the market that wasn't being filled. We wanted to talk about the things that people were talking about, but weren't necessarily being written about. Right. So this kind of reminds me a little bit of your conversation with Carolyn a few weeks ago, where you talked about how she wanted to write about things people weren't talking about. We had a similar vibe, except we wanted to write about the stuff that people were talking about over lunch or at the water cooler, but people didn't have the guts to sort of put it out online or on the page, maybe because it was a little gossipy or controversial or scandalous or stuff that people aren't really supposed to talk about in polite company, like money. Those were the types of things that we wanted to cover at Above the Law.
So it was John you approached way back then at Breaking Media, the CEO. Okay. How many hours a day were you, when all of a sudden Above the Law hit and you're getting, you got to write, you're getting information in probably from emails from people or maybe anonymous tips. How many hours were you working?
I mean, I was in the early days working very hard. It was definitely a full-time job, so it was certainly the requisite 40 hours a week. But look, back then it was different. I was single. I didn't have kids. And so I was really hustling. I mean, I was probably working, I was probably at times working law firm hours, maybe not Wachtell hours, but I was, probably working 60, 70 hours a week. Because I think one thing I would say, I know that sometimes you ask your guests for advice about blogging. I kind of say that you get out of it what you put into it. So if you're kind of doing it and you're only putting in like hardly any time and it's an afterthought and you don't really write that much, you're not going to get as much out of it. Whereas if you actually are really diligent and committed and you put your heart into it and you put in a significant investment of time, you will get great rewards out of it. But it's proportional to what you put in. So in the early days of Above the Law, I was really hustling. And in the first 2 years, before Ellie and Cash and Stacy and Joe and Catherine arrived, I was the only writer. So I was by necessity hustling because I would try to put up 8 or 10 stories a day. And I was the only writer. So who's going to write those 8 or 10 stories? Me. So look, the stories were sometimes short, a couple hundred words. They didn't necessarily have to be these giant, 2,000 word features, but it was a lot of content. So I was working pretty hard.
Yeah, you bring that up about putting in your time. As a blogger. I mean, obviously you got to be passionate about it because you were passionate from get-go. What do you tell, even young lawyers who are graduating from law school? Some of them may not graduate from Harvard or Yale, so they're going to have to make a name for themselves. They're going to have to build relationships, going to have to network via the internet. What can a blog do for them if they have some passion? What would you tell them?
I think it can really mark you out as an expert on a particular topic. So even with Underneath Their Robes, when I revealed myself as the author of that, I would sometimes get invited by so-called mainstream media or MSM outlets to offer commentary on the Supreme Court because they saw that I was somebody who read a lot about the judiciary and talked to a lot of people about it and wrote about it knowledgeably. And I think that it can really mark you out as an expert. For me, I now have a different model. I
Right.
am a full-time blogger, so I make my living off of my content, really, a mix of both subscriptions and sponsorship revenue, although most of my content is actually free. But for lawyers who are still practicing lawyers, having a blog can really increase your profile. It can help you get clients. It can help you get marked out as an expert. So it can be very, very beneficial to your practice. But again, one caveat I would offer is it may take a while for you to see a return. And it's not exactly like, oh, I wrote a blog post and then tomorrow I get a client. Like you have to kind of keep doing it. And sometimes things will happen in funny ways. Maybe you'll be blogging about a topic and then you'll be invited to speak at a conference. And then maybe it will be at the conference that you meet somebody who later becomes a client. Or maybe it will be a reader notices your expertise and then they are asked to make a referral and they refer someone to you. So it's not this linear instant thing, but I think blogging for lawyers can be hugely beneficial.
Yeah, I used to compare it to, as a plaintiff's trial lawyer, I wanted to be well known as trying good cases. And I wanted to be an association like my State Trial Lawyers Association. I wanted to be on the board of my State Trial Lawyers Association. Used to be known as ATLA then, the Association of Trial Lawyers of America, but before they got afraid of being labeled as trial lawyers by the defense. And I became, a sustaining member there and went to conferences. And it was a lifelong thing. I thought maybe 15, 20-year track, and I would be that lawyer's lawyer that would get their work without having to worry about where it came from. Blogging, I started to realize, it was like steroids. I mean, it was like, wow, I could do in 2 years what used to take me 15. And if somebody would have given me a pill and said, this is do it in 2 years, you wouldn't have to do all that, I'd have taken it. I'm interested to ask you a question because you're blogging now as a profession, and it's great. I mean, what you cover in the judiciary, if people aren't following, they're missing out. In legal cases and stands that you're taking, against the White House and what should be done by law firms. Um, 2008, I think, is when I first started to hear the term content marketing. And I'd never heard that before because I called it publishing. It just happened that we were on blog software, so it was called blogging. But now inside firms, marketing governs what the lawyers write. Marketing reviews the content. Marketing will tell them whether they're doing a good job or bad job. What I'm starting to find, as I'll get to the question, is the lawyers that were blogging before all that started want no part of that program in the large firms. They've got their own publication over here. They're not going to the content marketing world where it's kind of tailored for analytics and click-throughs and whatnot. What's your take on all of that? Imagine you're in the large firm and you're building out a name and now you're being told, hey, I know you graduated from Harvard, Yale, but we have this content marketing program for you.
So it's interesting. I think that the problem with a lot of so-called content marketing is it is inauthentic. It's very manufactured. As you were saying, it's designed to appeal to things like search engine optimization. But I don't have a problem with lawyers writing about things that they are interested in, knowledgeable about, and passionate about that happens to also be a form of marketing in the sense that it's getting their name out there. What is marketing but getting your name out there? So I actually don't have a problem with so-called content marketing if it's good content. So one thing I should mention is on my current Substack newsletter, Original Jurisdiction, I occasionally run what I guess you could call content marketing or sponsored content, where I work with a sponsor to come up with a piece of content. But my approach, and the approach I really try to get my sponsors to accept, is I want that content to be just as interesting and compelling and authentic as so-called editorial content. I don't want people to read the sponsored content and think, oh, this is sponsored. So I try to come up with topics that people are interested in, and I try to write about them in an engaging way. And sure, there's a thing there's a thing somewhere in the post, you have to disclose this because of the FTC, what have you, which will reveal, okay, this is sponsored. But I think that when content is good and it happens to have ancillary marketing benefits, I don't have a problem with that.
Right. Neither do I. I think that makes sense. And at least it's getting done. I hear wild things like, well, gee, after 6 years, we have to delete all the lawyers' content that was on the website. We don't know whether we're going to keep it or not. Yes, this is true. And I've been told by some leaders in law firms that after 6 years, it can cause problems with search and whatnot. So we delete it. And I'm imagining, my gosh, a Harvard lawyer grad And they've written some really good insight or commentary, but nobody told them that their insight and commentary was going to be deleted once they hit age 34 or something. So there is some crazy things that do go on with some of that. You've had no problem taking a stand on things. And inside law firms, sometimes it's tougher. But what do you find most rewarding now that you're out on your current publication where you have taken the stands? I think you've talked about law firms needing to take a stand as opposed to take a back seat based on financial. You've taken some stands vis-a-vis the White House and whatnot. How do you view your role as a legal journalist and legal commentator?
So it's interesting. Different people have different approaches to this, and I think there can be a lot of different and valid approaches. I do take stands on issues, but I would not call myself necessarily an advocacy journalist in that I'm not necessarily trying to push a particular perspective. I view myself very much as somebody who is trying to explain the world to my readers. Here's what happened. Here's why it matters. Here's what I think about it. I'm trying to keep busy lawyers informed and aware of what's going on in the profession. So I'm not necessarily trying to make people more liberal or conservative or Republican or Democratic or anything like that. But I do take stands, as you mentioned, and I do tell people what I think. But I'm also giving them information that they can use to form their own opinions. And if they take a different opinion than mine, that's fine. Sometimes I have very productive exchanges with readers who have different opinions and worldviews, and I often learn from them. So I guess I view my role today as one of informing and explaining and enlightening. And there may be some opining in there and some taking of stands, but I really view myself almost as someone who is explaining things to friends. So I kind of think, okay, the readers are sort of like my friends and they're really busy. And unlike me, they're still full-time practicing lawyers. They don't have that much time and they want to know what's going on with this, what's going on with that, what's the deal with these executive orders against law firms, what's going on with these nationwide or universal injunctions, and they want somebody to just tell them, look, here's what you need to know. And so that's what I view my role as, I guess, explaining to readers, here's what you need to know.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. My folks grew up in Jersey. I grew up in Wisconsin. So imagine sitting with a long neck beer on the corner of the bar at the local pub and just explain what it is that you read to somebody else. One of the things I get disappointed sometimes in what lawyers they report. So they will just say that the case said this, the judge held this is what some side said this. But at the end, nobody says, this is what it means. Here's why I shared this with you. Is what I always went back to. So I laud you for, that's common sense to you, but the lawyers that are struggling with blogging, they don't get that concept of having to say,
Yep. No, it's interesting. When I was editing other folks at Above the Law, what I would always tell them was, yes, you need to say what happened. You need to reveal the news, report the news. But I would always say there has to be some value add. So it could be an insight. It could be situating the news into a broader context. It could be referencing something from history that the readers might not recall. It could be a joke. But there has to be some kind of value add. Otherwise, you're just reporting the news like 100 other outlets, and it's just really commoditized. And so there is this issue of what value are you adding? And it's interesting. I know you've talked about this with a bunch of your other guests. Artificial intelligence, I think, is making the need to add some kind of value much more important, because a lot of these AI tools are very good at telling you what happened. I could go on and ask ChatGPT or Claude or whoever, okay, well, tell me what happened in the Supreme Court, like the term is over, but what were the big decisions of this past June? And it will actually do a decent job of telling you. And I would mention the AI tools are also starting to be able to offer what we would call analysis, and they can tell you jokes. They're often pretty bad jokes, but if you ask ChatGPT to tell you a joke, it'll tell you a joke. We're just trying to, I guess, kind of stay ahead of the robots.
Yeah. Let me ask you if we were sitting having lunch or whatever, and I'd kind of tell you some of the work that we're working on and get your take to it. When I started out with LexBlog and publishing Real Lawyers at blog, I was talking to that lawyer where I was in rural Wisconsin, town of 50,000, and realized, my gosh, I could make a name statewide, local. I had helped people on AOL by then and built law community. And here it is, 30 years later. And I just feel like there's still no connection to the average lawyer to the average person. It still seems like a tremendous opportunity for LexBlog to basically say, let's look at all the great legal bloggers. Let's get them into a network. Let's let people see who they are, what they cover. Let's look for the places that aren't covered and where you might be passionate about. Maybe it's a particular ag issue in Iowa, where that's where you grew up and you decide to move back. What do you think about that concept of just that network, which is starting to show the possibilities and maybe connect with other people publish and to learn how to do it? What do you think about that whole concept? Because that excites me more than being that, we have the publishing platform itself, it works great, but to do something more meaningful in our society than even that, we can really begin to help more lawyers publish and we can connect them with people.
Oh, I think it's a great idea. I mean, in some ways, it's what you have been doing for all these years, but I think you can definitely continue it and build it out. And I think that one of the things that people do value so much about online publishing is the ability to make those connections. I've made a lot of so-called real life friends, like you, for instance, and Carolyn, and, any number of other people who were people that originally I just read on my screen. And now I know them in real life, and we have had meals and drinks together and things of that nature. So I think there's a huge, huge opportunity. And even in an age where now we have social media, which definitely can make it easier to form connections and to get content out there, I think there are still a lot of opportunities that remain unexplored.
Yeah, you moved obviously off ATL and got into original jurisdiction. What do you like about the Substack platform? What do you like about it? What would you like to see? I'm just real curious because you're somebody that's all in and you're building, a magazine presence, if you will.
Yeah, so I think what I really do like about original jurisdiction and the Substack model is there's a very direct relationship with the reader because it is a blog. There is a website. The entries appear there in a sort of reverse chronological order, but it's also a newsletter and it goes into people's inboxes and people have opted in to receive it. And a certain percentage of readers are even paying to receive it. And so you have this more direct relationship with the reader. At Above the Law, we had a blog and people would check it when they had free time or when they saw something maybe promoted on social media. But with a newsletter, you're really getting right in there. You're getting into somebody's inbox. And look, I don't expect people to read everything I write or to read it right away, but people do read it, and I have a pretty good open rate on the newsletter, and I think there's just a more direct relationship. The other thing I would mention is, well, I now have sponsors on Original Jurisdiction, but more of my revenue is still from subscribers, and I actually like the subscription model over the advertising model because I feel that my main allegiance is to my readers or subscribers. Not that at Above the Law we were changing our content to fit the needs of the advertisers. I don't think people who know the publication will say that. I think it is a very independent publication and not afraid to tick people off. But, there was still a sense of, well, maybe we'll write more about this or more about that because there's going to be advertiser interest in that area. Here, I can write about what my readers are interested in. I like this model for that reason. I like the way that it helps you, quote unquote, monetize your content. And again, there are different strategies. For a lot of lawyers, the content is free, but it is just a way of getting their name out there. And if you get one case or client out of your blogging, that kind of pays for all the time you put into it. So there are different models, but for me, as someone who no longer practices law, my model is to charge for the content, and again, I also do now have sponsors.
How long have you had that publication on Substack? How long?
So I started it in December of 2020, and for the first couple of months, I did not offer a paid tier. And then in May of 2021, so a little more than 4 years ago, I started offering paid subscriptions. But as I mentioned earlier, the bulk of my content is free.
Right.
Because you really do have to appeal to people and show why it's worthwhile for them to pay for it. And most of the stuff that's behind the paywall tends to be a little more inside baseball, the kinds of stuff that maybe, people aren't necessarily going to be that interested in unless they're really immersed in a particular world or in a particular niche. So even free subscribers, I think, can get a huge amount of value, I like to think, from the content I'm putting out there.
And how's it gone? Obviously, I would guess you'd be a model role story for them. And there have been conversations between you and Zach, your husband, and you go, hey, this thing is really going to work.
Yeah, no,
This is working well. How
no,
how would you describe it over this last number
no,
of
it's been
years?
great. I've been really pleasantly surprised. I wasn't necessarily sure what kind of traction I would get, but I have a lot of readers, a lot of paid subscribers. I have, I don't know, more than 23,000 total subscribers. A subset of them are paid, not all
Right.
of them. But between the subscriber revenue and the sponsorship revenue, it's a very, by journalism standards, not by law standard, but by journalism standards, it's a very good living. And again, I just really enjoy it. And, I also can do it a little bit more on my own time because what I'm offering tends to be more in the vein of news analysis, explaining what's important. It's not pure news in the sense that, okay, this happened, I need to write about it immediately. Above the Law is much more pure news. It's like,
Right.
okay, this firm raised salaries, we need to write about it right away. I can wait, and then I can tell you a few days later, okay, here's what this pay raise means. Here's why it's important. Here are the possible implications or ramifications of that. Unlike Above the Law, where they publish to this day 15 or 20 stories a day, I publish much less frequently. I publish probably 2 to 3 things a week, but the things tend to be longer. They often reflect some kind of reporting, more research. So it's a different model. I happen to like it. I think it offers me very good work-life balance because I don't have to report on the news immediately. But some people might not like it. If you really love being on top of breaking news and getting a lot of scoops out there, my model's a little different. I break some news, but I don't break as much news as I used to at Above the Law. It's a different model.
And you as a journalist, a commentator, I mean, I think the first time, I think I may have met you before, but you invited me with Breaking Media to New York to a kind of a law blog event. I believe it was at the Yale Club. And Floyd Abrams was speaking on First Amendment rights. And I'm just going, this is pretty cool. And you were up on the stage doing interviews with people. And I remember sitting back thinking, I'm a little bit older than you. And I'm going, this is like, a young Ted Koppel. I remember when Ted started covering when people were taking hostages and whatnot. Because of your publishing, it certainly put you on the map with people reaching out to you for interviews, op-ed pieces. I mean, you're all over the place, aren't you? I mean, I don't want you to brag, but it certainly put you in the map and allowed you to play a major role in the law. I mean, aren't you also, where else do you publish for op-ed pieces?
So I publish a column for Bloomberg Law every other week, and that column does eventually get republished at original jurisdiction. I'm allowed to do that under my agreement with them. And then the other thing I do, when you mentioned Ted Koppel, I do a podcast, just like this podcast,
Right.
where I interview interesting people. It's like this format, an interview format. And I've had some amazing guests, and it's just a lot of fun. And I've really enjoyed the podcast medium. And one of the things I'm sure listeners to this can appreciate is you can explore things in greater depth. I mean, I don't know how long our conversation will end up being, but it's going to be pretty substantial. Whereas sometimes I'll do TV or radio news hits and you get a complex issue and you're supposed to talk about it for 2 to 5 minutes. It's really hard to say anything in 2 to 5 minutes. And especially given the law where the issues are often complex and you want to be accurate too. So I really like the podcasting platform as well as the newsletter platform.
Yeah, this is new to me. People were after me to do one for the last 15 plus years, and I had never listened to podcasts very much, so I couldn't get my mind around it. But I always enjoyed selfishly having a personal conversation with somebody where I could ask them the questions I was most interested in. And I followed Larry King's philosophy of you don't really know what the next question should be until you think about what the audience may want to hear. So have some notes, but doesn't need to be perfect. One thing that I followed very closely with you, because it was also a time after my wife had just died of cancer, was COVID. And, I followed you guys, your husband, Zach. I think you had one child, Harlan, by then, I believe. And you get COVID. And not just get it, but got it very seriously in the hospital. All we're hearing on TV is if somebody's on a respirator. that is just not a good sign. What was all that about from your perspective, the patient, or maybe describe the victim, because it was tough to follow, feeling like a friend
Yeah,
on Facebook.
it was interesting. I got COVID very early on in the pandemic in March of 2020, and I went into NYU Langone Hospital, and I was there for around 3 weeks, including almost a week on a ventilator, which, as you mentioned, was
Ventilator. Yeah.
kind of a very scary thing back then because
Right.
the survival rates of people on ventilators, which are these
Right.
machines that help you breathe, was not high. But what I wound up doing was I essentially wound up live blogging the experience because I wrote about my COVID experience on Twitter and Facebook. And initially, I was just doing it to give people I had interacted with a heads up because I was in such bad shape. I could barely breathe. I didn't have the presence of mind to go through my appointment book and notify people that I'd seen in the past few weeks. Apologies. I may have unwittingly gave you COVID. I didn't know I had it. So I just kind of made these mass announcements and I didn't know how it would be received. I wasn't sure if people would be upset or something, but it actually ended up being really great. People responded with so much support, wishes to get well. And it was just so great that I just kept on doing it because it was helping me go through that very, very difficult time in my life to get all of this support and all of these good wishes. It was so early on in the pandemic, so it was before everything had become political and before everyone had kind of retreated to their corners. So I got get well wishes from across the ideological spectrum, from, Ted Cruz to Susan Rice. Chris Christie, Preet Bharara. These are Republicans. These are Democrats. I got a get well tweet from Cher. It was wild. I mean, it was just a crazy time. But I was really one of the first people to have such a serious case and to be so public about it. And I was trying to inform people about this virus that we just had a very poor understanding of at the time.
Yeah, I mean, Facebook is a fascinating place. I mean, I decided one day when we were sitting chemo day, and I decided I would log it personally because I had to express my feelings, at least to myself. But I don't know, 2/3 of the day, I had what looked like a post on, like my explanation of today. And I showed it to two of my kids after my wife said, I asked her, I said, what do you think? And she, what do the kids think about sharing it? And they said, it sounds good. And then I asked my wife, and she said, let it go. And from that moment on, everything was out there every day. Every event, the highs, the lows, and the thank you notes I got from people that said, I showed this to my dad. I showed this to my mom. This really helps. I printed this out. The ability for you to help people through being transparent and open through the highs and the lows is really an incredible experience. I don't know what you have found personally, but for me, it's been really something.
No, I totally agree. And I was very moved and touched by a lot of the writing that you generated, when Jill was going through what she was going through. It's just human connection. I think social media sometimes gets this bad rap. People say, oh, it's making teens anxious, or it's making people depressed. And don't get me wrong, I acknowledge social media can have a lot of downsides, but I think we should not forget the upsides and the ability to forge these connections and this ability to be there for each other. It's not all bad.
No, I mean, the day that I saw Zach and Harlan, and I think it was like a ukulele or something, playing at the house. I don't think you were back at the hospital yet, but Dad's going to come home.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm like tearing up watching this. It was amazing. And the one event that I wish I would have gotten to this year, I think it was June 14th. I think someday that sticks in my head, was kind of a celebration of this many years removed from getting out of the hospital back in New York, where you gathered friends together. I thought that was great, what you guys did.
Yeah, it was sort of a 50th birthday / original jurisdiction reader appreciation party / thank you to everyone who was there for me 5 years ago. And so, yeah, it was wonderful to gather all these people together. I think it was June 12, I think, was the date. It was a week before my actual birthday, June 19. But it was really just a wonderful occasion, and it was really nice to see people and to be able to thank them in person for, granted, it was a big event. I got to talk to each person for 30 seconds, but it was really just so wonderful to see so many people there.
I bet it was. I mean, you have a family now. You got Zach, Harlan, Chase. How do they influence the way you work today, what you think about, what you write about? How does that, I mean, obviously these things aren't two separate lives. We only have one. How does it come together and influence you?
Yeah, so as you know, I know you take the same approach. I don't really keep them that separate.
Right.
I will write about my family in my newsletter, and I think readers appreciate it because they feel they know the person behind the screen, and I really like it. My husband, Zach, I actually got him to enter blogging too. He's now the
Right.
executive editor of SCOTUS blog as of May. He also left the practice of law and he's really enjoying that. Now, look, he's a little different. He is not quite as sharing of his personal stuff as I am. But you know what? That's fine. Like different people have different approaches and you have to go with what fits your personality and your temperament. For me, I like doing this, but I understand that maybe there are other legal bloggers out here there who are more private or maybe they have security concerns or what have you. And so I totally understand and respect that. I think everyone needs to find what they're comfortable with.
It does really build that trust, though. I mean, it was what I have found. I mean, if you're talking about the judiciary, judicial ethics, all these type of issues, people have come to trust you because you're who you are, and it's who your family is. Last question I wanted to ask you: what's the importance of having this independent legal publisher today, based on all the changes we're seeing in society? What's the importance of it?
Well, I think that the importance of it is I just feel I have the ability to call things as I see them. I do think that when you are part of a larger news organization, you are constrained. You have various institutional roles, you have editors, you are not speaking quite as directly to the audience. And don't get me wrong, I subscribe to a million publications, and I am very, very grateful for the work that is done by traditional media. But I think there's also a place for those of us who are independent publishers and don't have these particular connections and can speak very directly to people and very personally about a lot of the important issues that we're dealing with right now, whether it's the rule of law or judicial independence or what have you. And so I think it's just the ability to speak freely and authentically about issues that matter. That's really what I find so important about this platform and about legal publishing and blogging today.
Yeah, I mean, I worry about the future. I mean, I can see the difference. I mean, I could somehow connect to World War II slingshotting off my parents and hearing about all of that. And then looking at what's going on today looks a little bit scary to me. And I look at what more, lawyers were put here for a reason. We were supposed to take a stance on the law, the Constitution, and whatnot. I mean, are there things that you would tell other lawyers to maybe get out there and get involved in this process? And I know that's not your job. You're a journalist, but do you feel maybe there should be more lawyers out there publishing in an open and honest way to what their observations are?
I think so. But I would say, look, do what you can. I recognize that people sometimes have constraints.
Right.
And maybe you work for a large firm and they may not be happy if you do this, that, or the other thing. And people have mortgages and people have tuition for their kids. And I get that. I realize I have sort of a luxury in being independent and having my own platform. And so I don't have to worry about getting fired. I mean, people can unsubscribe if I do something terrible, but it is different. So I realize I'm in a very fortunate position. So I would just tell people, do what you can. Maybe that's volunteering for something at the Bar Association. Maybe that's writing an op-ed here or there. Maybe that's participating in a rally or a protest for something that's important to you. But do what you can. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, I got involved in local causes as a plaintiff's trial lawyer and then watched the files get picked up from my partners at the law firm as people pulled the work. So it does impact things, and you do have a mortgage to pay and whatnot. I really want to thank you, David. It's been a real honor and a pleasure to get your perspective on publishing, form of blogging, whatever you want to call it. It's publishing. So it's a real pleasure to have you on Real Lawyers. I have blogs. This is a podcast that's produced by the LexBlog Network, the world's largest legal publishing network. And you can pick up this podcast wherever you subscribe to a podcast. Thank you very much.